Hey y'all, it's me, Kevy! We've made it through another month, which means it's time for my first wrap-up of the year. For most of the month, I felt like I barely got any reading done, and it seemed like I was just having a real bad reading month. Despite that, I managed to finish 15 books in January. To be fair, 5 of them were children's books, 1 was an audiobook, 1 was a super short story, and 1 was a book without words. But even subtracting all of those, it was still a pretty solid reading month. Let's take a look at what I read. The first book I read in January was Whose Body by Dorothy L. Sayers. I read this as a buddy read with Sandy at Miss Reads a Lot. Dorothy L. Sayers is a contemporary of Agatha Christie and one of the prominent figures in the golden age of detective fiction. Whose Body is the first book in her Lord Peter Wimsey series. Lord Peter Wimsey is a rich man with too much time on his hands, so he likes to solve crimes for fun. In Whose Body, one of his mother's acquaintances wakes up to find a dead man in his bathtub, naked except for a pair of glasses. I hate to say it, but I did not like this book one bit. It's a really short book, only about 100 pages, yet it was an incredibly slow read. Sandy and I thought we'd breeze through it in a couple of days, but it was such a challenge that first we had to extend it, then we just gave up altogether and blasted through the remainder of it on audiobook at triple speed, just so we could get it over with. I found myself thinking this book would have been so much better had it been written by Mary Roberts Rinehart. Several times it reminded me of Window at the White Cat, which made me wish I was just reading that instead. Honestly, I probably would have DNF'd it had I not been buddy reading it. It was awful. There was only one scene that I really enjoyed, and that was when they were trying to get the medical man to remember what had happened last Tuesday, talking him through the day and referring back to his journal to help him piece it together. That was really fun, but the rest of it sucked. Oh, and then, rather than having the killer revealed in a classic whodunit twist at the end, they announced who it was in chapter 7, then spent the remainder of the book just procuring evidence against him. So the ending wasn't at all satisfying because they played their hand way too early. I really wanted to enjoy this one, but no, I hated my first book of 2022. After the shared toothache of reading Whose Body together, I felt Sandy and I needed a palate cleanser. So I implored her to follow this up with another buddy read, this time reading The Swimming Pool by Mary Roberts Rinehart. This book was exactly what I needed. It was so good. The Swimming Pool is about a socialite who shortly after divorcing her husband becomes a recluse, seemingly in fear of her life. And then one day a body is found in the pool on her family's property, and the dead woman shares a strong resemblance to her. I love the way Mary Roberts Rinehart flavors her text. Her had I but known writing style will foreshadow things by saying things like, I had no idea at the time that this bird would play such a pivotal role in the mystery. Or, I'm sitting here holding this clue that seemed so insignificant back then. It was so amusing reading these characters' tangents. And then she would say, oh, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I just really enjoy that style of mystery writing. The narrator mentions at some point she will be visiting a character in the hospital, then just goes right back to the story, leaving you full of questions. When does she go to the hospital? How did she end up there? And does she make it out alive? Oh, I love that. This was another mystery that I was able to solve. The funny thing is, though, that the thing that got me first on the right track wasn't even a proper clue. When they revealed everything at the end, there was no mention of the piece of evidence that I had latched onto. So while I may have gotten there from a false lead, it at least did point me in the right direction. I had so much fun reading The Swimming Pool, and it was such a delight after Whose Body. Thank you, Sandy, for agreeing to read this with me. It just further cements that Mary Roberts Rinehart is my favorite mystery writer. Y'all know how much I love The Golden Girls, and Betty White's passing was quite a loss. When my nephews went back to school, Danny told me his class was going to be honoring Betty White by listening to an audiobook she recorded. Isn't that right, Danny? Uh-huh. I decided to look up that audiobook and listen to it myself. The book was Harry the Dirty Dog. The video of her reading it is here on YouTube, and only a few minutes long. It's such a heartwarming video. Betty White was a lifelong animal rights advocate, and she recorded Harry the Dirty Dog to help dogs find homes. She was a national treasure, and I'll have the video linked in the description below if you'd like to experience it for yourself. I read 2 NetGalley books in January. As usual, my full thoughts on them will be saved for a special NetGalley video, so I'll just mention them briefly. The first was Art of the Decoy by Trish Edsen. This is a cozy mystery of the antique dealer variety, and the first book in Edsen's Scandal Mountain Antiques series. It's about a woman who has to take over her family's antique business after her mother was sent to prison for forgery, and then a crime is committed that could implicate her family, and she needs to uncover the truth before she joins her mother behind bars. The other NetGalley read was a reread, this time listening to The Christie Affair by Nina de Gramont as an audiobook. It's an historical fiction novel about Agatha Christie's disappearance, told from the perspective of Archie's mistress, Nan O'Day. The audiobook did a great job of capturing the magic of the novel, and I loved it just as much, if not more so, the second time around. I had a lot of reading projects going on in January. My buddy reads with Sandy, trying to solve an Agatha Christie, reading NetGalley stuff, the Discworld read-along, my nephew choosing my TBR, and each of these was on a tight schedule. I had one day in between projects, so I decided to read Nellie Bly's 10 Days in a Madhouse. This was an excellent piece of journalism from the 1800s, where Nellie Bly got herself committed to a mental institution so she could write about the experience. The things that she witnessed and went through were awful, but thanks to her work, the city of New York made improvements to the living conditions of these women. This book is short, but it is heavy and historically significant. Like I had just mentioned, I tried to solve an Agatha Christie mystery on camera, vlogging my experience. The book I attempted to solve was the Poirot novel Murder in Mesopotamia. I won't get into that book too much more on here because I already have a whole video dedicated to it. That video was a lot of work and I'm really proud of it, so please go check it out if you haven't yet. This month, I finally got around to picking up Tell Me About It 3 by my friends, the Chicago queer historians St. Sukie Delacroix and Owen Keehnan. The Tell Me About It series is a collection of LGBTQ secrets, confessions, and life stories. Basically, it's our oral history written down. In each installment, they ask a series of questions, and queer people from around the world respond with their personal experiences. See, this is the first book in the series, and I even have an autographed copy. Tell Me About It 3 is special though, because I am one of the voices recorded in it. Yeah, my words are printed in this book. The questions in this volume include things like, when was the first time you realized you were different? When did you first hear about AIDS? And what are your thoughts on the social and cultural assimilation of queer people? My favorite quote from myself in this book was in response to that last question. I said, as a fat, disabled, assimilation is not an option for me. I am a radical queer, and we need to keep fighting for those of us who can't assimilate into cis-het culture. Isn't that good? I did good, yes. But that sentiment is really important to me because it's easy to fight for things like gay marriage, but it seems a lot harder to get momentum for issues like queer homelessness, making things safer and easier for transgender sex workers, and so on. We need to help those on the furthest fringes of our society because they are the ones who need the help the most. Yeah, this book is full of rich histories. Historically, long before the invention of the internet, queer history was very much an oral history. Our stories weren't written down, they weren't in textbooks and stuff. They were passed down to you from your queer elders, the drag queens in the dressing room, or the bartenders, or whoever you talk to. Our history was preserved because people would share it with each other. But then AIDS happened, and the queer community was decimated. I've heard that about 90% of queer entertainers of that time were lost to that virus. With the loss of those people, we also lost a lot of our history. So much of our queer oral history is just gone because the people who shared those stories are no longer with us. So I am so grateful to Owen and St. Sukie for recording these voices and preserving queer history's oral traditions. Because if we don't continue to write down more of our history, it could be lost forever. For one of my videos this month, I had my nephew choose 4 books for my TBR. You can see his hilarious video over here and in the description. The first one I read was Dog Man and Cat Kid, book 4 in this Captain Underpants spin-off series. I didn't really care for it. It's mostly just toilet humor and mental illness jokes. The only time I thought it was saying something profound turned out to not even be an original line. It was just quoting East of Eden. Next time I think I would just rather read East of Eden. Next we read Grime and Punishment, book 9 in the Dogman series. I like this one quite a bit more than the first. It still had the potty humor and mental illness jokes, but at least it explored some interesting themes, like whether we should love or hate the people who have hurt us. It also made the police look foolish, which I'm always a fan of. So yeah, not great, but better than its predecessor. After that, we read The Tower Treasure, the first book in the Hardy Boys series. The Hardy Boys are ubiquitous, and I was excited to read one of these children's mystery novels for the first time. Right off the bat, though, I was put off by the description of the boys. From what I understood of the Hardy Boys through cultural osmosis, they had always seemed to be much younger, maybe early teens, when they're actually like 18, and riding motorcycles. I mean, I'm sure motorcycles at the time are nothing like the Harleys that I'm picturing, but that image in my head was just so incongruous with what I was reading. I also just wasn't a fan of the writing style. Its language was just a little too simplistic, and I thought the mystery was pretty boring. And there was nothing at stake. Like at one point the kids get trapped in a tower by a bad guy, and he leaves them there to rot. They escape on the next page. I guess maybe these complaints are just to be expected in a children's book, but it just wasn't my cup of tea. Finally, we read a Gravity Falls book. I introduced him to Gravity Falls over a year ago, and it's been one of his favorite shows ever since. This book was nice. It was basically just episode synopses retold as bedtime stories. So if you're looking for content to expand the world of Gravity Falls, or to read a new story about Dipper and Mabel, you're not going to find that here. But this is nice for a hardcore fan, and would be good as bedtime stories. I recently read about a fascinating historical artifact called the Voynich Manuscript, and decided to give it a read. Well, read isn't the right word for it, because this 15th century text is written in a language that no one has ever been able to identify or decipher. Yeah, it's really unusual. While much of the book's content is inaccessible, it is full of drawings, which help the reader understand what it could be about. The bulk of the manuscript is dedicated to botany, with diagrams of different plants. There's also a section dedicated to cosmology, and then another curious portion is just drawings of naked women in the bath. This book is strange, but fun to look at. The whole thing has been digitized, so I'll have the link to view it in the description below. One of the projects I was most excited for this month was the Discworld Equal Rites read-along. I was asked to co-host this read-along with Katya at Read Write Create, Scott at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, and Rosie Cockshut. This was fun because all three of them are lifelong fans of the series, while I was the only newbie. This was only my second Discworld novel, after going postal, which I read in November. Equal Rites, like many of the earlier Discworld novels, is very much a parody of traditional fantasy tropes. In particular, Equal Rites looks at the unspoken rule that all magical women are witches and magical men are wizards, that you'll never see a male witch or a female wizard. So Equal Rites begins with a dying wizard doing a ritual to pass along his wizard magic to this child, the eighth son of an eighth son. But then, once the ritual is completed, they realize the child is a girl, and they've suddenly created the Discworld's first girl wizard. This book did an excellent job contrasting the two types of magic. Witch magic, surprisingly, was mostly just smoke and mirrors, a placebo. They'd wear a pointy hat because that's what people expect to see a witch wearing. The potions they would make weren't magic potions, they're just an expert on herbs and know what would help their predicament. This aspect of witch magic is called headology, putting on a show for the customer so that they think the magic is working. But despite most witch magic not being magic, we do see some very vivid examples of their abilities. One ability is called borrowing, where a witch can hitch a ride inside the mind of another animal, and while not outright controlling it, they can gently guide it towards doing things. This was a fascinating magic system, and I loved learning about it. Wizard magic, on the other hand, is all the magic spells and conjuring and fire and stuff like that. We don't see as much wizard magic or an explanation of wizard magic, probably because the 2 previous books in the series focused on wizards. But we do get to spend some time at the Unseen University, which is the Discworld's wizard school. Like in Going Postal, my favorite element of the wizard section of the story is their magical library. The idea is that when a wizard writes down his magic, the words he's written aren't just words on paper. They themselves contain magic. So then when you take hundreds of these magical pages and bind them up and shelve it along thousands of other magical books, a lot of weird stuff is gonna go down. I love seeing all the weird ways that magic distorts the library. Also, the head librarian is an orangutan. He used to be a human wizard until he got magically transformed. Then when they were going to change him back, he insisted on remaining a monkey, because in this form, life was so much simpler. His only concern in life was when he would find his next banana. Like Going Postal, this book is so funny. In that first scene, after the wizard's ritual, he passes away and gets to talk to Death. He ponders the possibility of reincarnation and having to start the process as an ant. Death tells him he would have to work his way up to being an ant, and the next time we see this wizard, he's been reincarnated as a tree. Also, when they're describing the tiny mountain village of Badass, they say it's too small to show up on a map of the mountains. It would barely show up in a map of the village. And then there's the whole thing about Granny adjusting to life as a city witch and her relationship with the wizard cut angle. I ship 'em. But my favorite part of Equal Rites was undoubtedly unintentional on Terry Pratchett's part. While this book was written to challenge gender roles, I found it to be an excellent transgender allegory. Esk is born a girl wizard. She has no choice in the matter. It's how she was born, who she is. Then her entire childhood, Granny Weatherwax refuses to accept her as a wizard and instead tries to train Esk to be a witch. This was just so reminiscent of how families of trans children will often ignore the truth of their child, even when it's right in their faces. But eventually, Granny realizes that as much as she is opposed to it, Esk has wizard magic inside of her and needs to go to wizard school to learn how to properly use it. This could be understood as Esk finally being able to transition and live as her authentic self. Then she gets to the Unseen University, and all the wizards say she has no place there. They laugh at her and kick her out. That echoes all those conversations surrounding transgender people in gendered public places, like bathrooms and sports. Trans people are often forcibly ejected from such places, sometimes even through violence. And then at the very end, when Esk is finally accepted as a wizard and given a wizard's hat, she comments how she feels no different now that she has the hat. This was just so relatable from a trans perspective. When we transition, who we are doesn't change. We're still the same person that we've been all along. It's just everyone else's perspective of us that changes. So while other people will now recognize her as a wizard with a wizard hat, she's still the same wizard she's been this entire journey. So yeah, while this book wasn't written to be a trans allegory, I found it surprisingly relatable to the trans experience, and I would love to see other readers explore it from that perspective. I've spent the final days of January buddy reading Project Hail Mary with my Aunt Jan. I'm not going to share my thoughts on it right now because we haven't finished reading it, and we're going to have a whole video about it next month. But when I was looking up the author, Andy Weir, I realized that this isn't my first time reading him. Many years ago, when I was first getting into creepypastas and no sleep, I read his short story, The Egg. I really loved it back then, so I decided to give it a quick reread. It's still so good. It's an afterlife story, and I am a big fan of afterlife fiction. I just think people can get so creative with that concept. The Egg is only a page or two, but it packs a punch and is really a phenomenal story. In January, I made no progress on my birthday reads. and I'm pretty disappointed about that. I just had way too many other projects going on this month. So I've decided that for February, I am not taking on a single side project. I will just be reading things off my birthday list as much as possible. I mean, I may also do some black feminism and a NetGalley book or two. But for the most part, I will be focusing on all these books that y'all were so kind to give me last year, and I really want to get around to reading them. So there you have everything I read in January. Have you read any of these? Do you want to? How are your New Year's reading goals coming? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if it pleases and sparkles, I'll see you in the next video. Mwah!